Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the big and interesting developments in the region. Today, I will talk about the Russian private military contractor, the Wagner Group, and how it's fared since the suspicious death of its legendary leader, Yevgheny Prighozin, who went from being a caterer to the greatest threat to Russia's President Vladimir Putin. With me here to discuss the Wagner Group is John Lechner, who spent long years studying Wagner and interviewing its operatives in Africa, Ukraine, and the Near East. John has recently published a fantastic book on the subject called Death is Our Business, Russian Mercenaries and the New Era of Private Warfare. So welcome to our show, John.
Thank you for having me.
Lots to talk about, but I want to kick off by asking you about where the Wagner Group currently stands after the death of Prigozhin. What is its status?
To answer that question, I think you have to delve in a little bit to the places where Wagner was, the context of those environments in which they were intervening, and the relative relationship between Prigozhin structures and the Russian state. And so if we think kind of more broadly about where Wagner was at the moment of Prigozhin's death, until relatively recently, they had a lot of men in Ukraine. Obviously, a lot of those men then returned into Russia to participate in the mutiny. They had men, contractors in Syria, in Libya, in the Central African Republic, and Mali, and perhaps to a very small extent in Sudan, which was in the beginning of the throes of a civil war. And the relationship between the Russian state and Prigozhin's structures was different in each one of those countries where they were operating. In a place like Ukraine, where the war being fought is clearly at least portrayed as existential to Russia, you have all other Russian institutions that are present, like the Russian Ministry of Defense, the FSB, the military intelligence, the GRU. And I think that shows the degree to which the Russian state itself was also interested. In Syria as well, and we can go into kind of the history of that intervention. But again, Wagner was always one of many Russian institutions and security institutions that were present in the country. It was an overt Russian intervention through the Ministry of Defense. Once you get to places in Africa, like the Central African Republic, these are areas where the Russian state doesn't really have a national interest. There isn't a big embassy. There isn't, a bunch of defense attachés and FSB operatives and GRU. And so this was a place where Prigozhin could be left relatively unchecked and basically represented the Russian state itself, and Mali as well to a lesser extent. And so after Prigozhin's death, as the Russian state was looking to kind of take over these operations, their ability and interest in doing so was different in each of these places, right? And the Central African Republic wasn't really that important. And so the decision was kind of made, well, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So maybe a few guys were changed, but the structure largely stayed in place. In Libya as well, it was kind of more important, but the the Russian state had an easier time replacing Wagner because, as you know, since the 2020 ceasefire, there wasn't really kind of direct military participation in an offensive or anything along those lines. The Russians were largely sitting on a base. It's relatively easy to come, give them a new contract. Few guys who don't want to join, they go back home. It's easy to replace them.
Could we talk a little bit about where Wagner is still active inside the Middle East?
In Libya, it's safe to say that the Wagner units have been replaced by Africa Corps, which is directly subordinate to the Russian Ministry of Defense. In Syria, I mean, obviously the conversation has changed a lot since. I mean, I was in northeast Syria in October, and it looked like the Russians would be there for a very long time. Now, whether they will be there at all is still very much up for debate. Prior to that in Syria, there was efforts to replace all of the Wagner structures with uh, military intelligence and MOD personnel. Wagner, I mean, as you know, hadn't really been participating in kind of direct military operations for some time. In Syria, they were largely conducting training, protecting sites. One interesting thing that was a that the Russian state had to deal with in terms of trying to hand over the assets that Prigozhin owned was there was a fear that any attempt to change ownership or change the structure in some meaningful way would result in the Assad government trying to grab those assets back. And so there was an effort to kind of try to change things without actually really changing things in the hopes that kind of Assad and those close to him wouldn't try to take over those assets.
So just to be clear, are there currently any Wagner people left in Syria? Because we know there clearly are Russian troops there still on the bases, and also even in places like Kamishli in the Kurdish-controlled region. So are there still Wagner assets on the ground in Syria?
I mean, there might be men who have served with Wagner. It's difficult to say, but I mean, at this point, I would say that the distinction is meaningless. Or not meaningless, but for all intents and purposes, even if it is Wagner, they are subordinate to the Ministry of Defense.
So let me ask you, if, let's say, Wagner was in place in the way it was at its peak in Syria, do you think that we would have had a different scenario currently in Syria, that it would have been harder for the HTS and the other groups to overthrow the Assad regime?
I mean, that's a serious question. What that would have required as well was that the Russian MOD wasn't stretched as it was in Ukraine as well, because even Russian air assets in Syria had kind of slowly been dwindling over time and redistributed to what Moscow calls its special military operation in Ukraine. And without those serious air assets, it would have been tough for even Wagner to protect or not protect, but to defend territory.
So
So
it's really down to Ukraine, a lot of this, what we've seen unfold, and of course Israel and October
I think I would
7th.
even say even more so down to Iran's inability to move reinforcements into Syria at that time is probably um, it's probably more important than whether or not there were 1,500 Russian mercenaries there at the time. I think it would be difficult to say that there are really kind of Russian PMCs currently active in the Middle East outside of perhaps some of the smaller companies that are contracting for protecting ships, things along those lines in the Gulf of Aden. And then Africa Corps, as we mentioned, is active in Libya.
And what about Sudan?
Sudan is a bit of a black box at the moment. We know, Prigozhin obviously worked closely with both the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces, the RSF. And at the outbreak of the civil war in Sudan, Wagner was supplying to a small degree the RSF through the Central African Republic to Darfur. But the conflict has kind of reached such a scale that it's very difficult, I think, for any international actor to be really working there on the ground. And the Russian state itself has switched towards more support for the Sudanese army. And so I think Wagner itself has probably less of a presence there now.
But you mentioned in the book that the UAE was probably financing Wagner and helping the RSF, and it continues to, as we all know, help the RSF. What would you have to say about the role of Middle Eastern governments in propping up these kinds of outfits, given the amount of money they have, the deep pockets they have, and how that sort of impacts the regional order, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that the UAE in particular, but also Saudi Arabia, Qatar are very active in Africa. For the UAE, uh, the strategy of using mercenaries to a degree makes a lot of sense. They have, as you said, very deep pockets and a very small population. And so for a country that has incredible ambition on the world stage to make Dubai the center of commerce and a provider of, in their mind, security, fighting jihadism before it reaches their country itself. They outsource a lot of that activity to mercenaries. They've worked with U.S. mercenaries. They've worked with obviously Wagner very much in Libya and in Sudan as well.
And we now see Turkey. Turkey's kind of the new kid on the block, right? With Sadat, the Turkish military contractor, whose owner or founder is a very close associate of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. We hear that they are becoming more and more active in some of the places that Wagner or other Russian PMCs are active. We also hear that they actually don't necessarily compete, but can cooperate as well. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
Yeah, I think the political economy of both Russia and Turkey and the political system allows for a lot of compartmentalization, shall we say, when it comes to foreign policy. So as you said, Russia and Turkey were on opposite sides in Syria. They were on opposite sides in Libya. There's a great section in the book where Sadat's mercenaries from Syria are fighting against Wagner's mercenaries from Syria in
Yes,
Tripoli.
yes.
Um, but in other areas, that doesn't create these kind of boundaries or obstacles to working together, especially economically between various companies in a place like Mali. And so, ironically, Bayraktars were Wagner's greatest nemesis in the Libyan conflict and provide
The drones,
intelligence
the
to
Turkish
Wagner. Yeah,
drones.
the drones, sorry, the Bayraktar drones, and they provide intelligence to Wagner on the ground in Mali. And and so both systems are kind of set up in a way where they can work together, in the UAE as well. They can work together in discrete areas where money can be made and there are kind of aligned political objectives and can still compete with each other in other areas.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
Can you talk a little bit about the business model for us? For all of these companies, be they Russian or American or Turkish? And Africa is
Sure.
obviously a very good example of that, where you've spent so much time.
Yeah, and I do think Wagner was in a lot of respects unique. I talk about it in the beginning of the book, sort of the origins of kind of modern mercenarism with the South Africans in the 90s who kind of provided a whole kit for other governments, right? A military in a little box. You hire us, we will, train and then go after the rebels. Blackwater came about amidst this overall massive kind of trend of privatization of government services, right? And so Blackwater's primary client was the United States, the US government. The more it could embed itself within the national security infrastructure, the more money it could make from recurring contracts. Wagner was sort of a blend of the two. It could contract with the Russian government. It very much was dependent on Yevgeny Prigozhin's personal contacts and personal ambition, but it could also go out. It had the freedom, again, because of kind of the political economy of Putin's system. It had the freedom to go out and contract with individual African governments as well and pursue all sorts of activities that Prigozhin thought could help finance. Um, he was the glue that held all of those very disparate businesses and visions together. And so what we've seen, going back to one of your first questions, is that the handover has been very difficult because imagine a Russian military officer showing up in the Central African Republic and finding out he has to take over a brewery and like a vodka distillery and like a gold mine. Like
Yeah.
these guys are military guys. They understand perhaps counterinsurgency, but they're not, they don't know how to run a gold mine and they don't necessarily want to. And so, so much of what we've chalked up to, especially in Africa, sort of this Russian hybrid warfare strategy, was really Prigozhin's vision of how he could create these various businesses that were synergistic and complementary to each other.
And now being aped by others, including Turkey, right?
Yeah, it's a model they created. I mean, they really, and this again is, very much it could Wagner could have only really come out of the Russian system at that time. But we should not discount either the ambition that Prigozhin and his associates had and the commercial aspects of it. And they created a new market for their services, and it is something that others who have kind of a similar system are able to imitate now. Turkey being one, the UAE, Rwanda as well.
You said that the UAE was keen to create its own militia. If I didn't misread
Yeah,
it.
there's been a number of reports. that the UAE is looking to raise its own foreign legion, and of course, the Foreign Legion has its own very interesting, history in the French Foreign Legion, but very active in Africa, and provided um, a lot of Russian speakers and Russian citizens with the skills that they needed to operate in Africa on for Wagner later on down the road too.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And one bit in the book really struck me where you have a Wagner guy saying that the difference between us and the Western guys is that we can sleep in the dirt on the street under the rain, something along those lines, and they can't. The only ones who can are the Ukrainians, and that's why it's proving so tough for us to fight them. So going back to the question that I raised in the middle of our conversation about me sensing a degree of sympathy for some of these characters, could you briefly speak to that? I mean, were
Yeah, I mean, I think.
were any of these people likable? Did you feel a connection?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I think, as a writer, in order to understand something, we try to enter into the world of how these people are thinking, and how they're viewing the world themselves. And look, I wouldn't say that, in general, these are not like the fuzziest guys to be around, but uh, the the human ability to rationalize our actions is basically limitless. And so I thought it was important to convey how they're seeing what they're doing, where the West sees them as a goal, looking to kind of sow chaos across Africa. They very much believe that they're bringing stability
Well, they
to these
brokered that
places.
deal in Sudan, as you detail in
I, I mean, they did do a peace deal for sure, and it fell apart, and a lot of it was, to try and get mining assets,
yeah.
but they still thought that they were doing a good thing.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you found this too in your reporting with a lot of actors in conflict. There's never really this moment where you think that you're going to pull the curtain, and the cynicism will finally show, like where they're like, oh, we say we do this, but we're really doing this. Um, and I always found that interesting. And so, in order to get the story, the real kind of I had to interview about 40 guys in Wagner, and so it is very much, you know, it conveys their understanding too of what they were doing. I try not to insert my own uh, judgments into it, but rather juxtapose their stories with stories of people who were victims of them, or who had, negative interactions with them.
Well, I think it takes um, a considerable degree of creating narratives to be able to, on the one hand, risk your own life and take the lives of others. So thank you so much for joining us today. Death is Our Business, Russian Mercenaries and the New Era of Private Warfare. Excellent book, and I'm sure it's going to sell like hotcakes.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for tuning in to our podcast. And for more in-depth information and analysis on the Middle East, go to our website, www.al-monitor.com.